There is wisdom. One scholar said it like this, and this is the choice before us this morning. There is wisdom, and there is what passes for wisdom. I like that. I like that distinction. There's wisdom, and there is what passes for wisdom. I had a funny little conversation yesterday about education. It was a funny, small little conversation, or more specifically about methods or philosophies of education. And in typical Chris fashion, I referenced a 75-year-old essay by C.S. Lewis. Thank you very much. And then I segued very smoothly to a YouTube video, okay? So that's very par for the course for me. If you add these two incontrovertible sources together, you must come to the conclusion that I know what I'm talking about. It was actually a conversation. It wasn't a debate or anything like that. So it doesn't really matter that I used a logical fallacy, that's a whole nother conversation. Appeals to authority. Pastors are really good at that. Talk to Logan about that afterwards. He knows all about logical fallacies. Not because he's good at them, he's just smarter than I am. Doesn't matter. That's my life, okay? That's my life, those kinds of conversations. So let me break down the logic of what I'm talking about again. This author is smart and highly esteemed. I quote this author, therefore people think I'm smart, and then they pat me on the back. That's what I'm talking about. This science YouTuber has millions of followers and millions of views, and he quotes multiple peer-reviewed studies, and I watched him demolish someone else. That's what you do on the internet, and therefore I am smarter than you. That's a fallacy. It's a fallacy. This wisdom, or else this kind of knowledge, is what passes for wisdom. It passes for wisdom a lot in our day. Now, the letter of James, or I actually think it's not so much a letter as much as it's an ancient sermon. This is a sermon that would have been preached possibly, and I think very likely, by Peter in various churches and things like that. But this ancient sermon is often described as wisdom literature, and that's because it is wisdom literature. It is very much wisdom literature. So characteristic of wisdom literature, and specific to our reading, is strong black and white statements, either or statements, this or that kind of speaking. And so here are some of the contrasts that we just heard Isaac read for us. You can have, or else you can have, or speak, or demonstrate, or show wisdom. You can do that, or you can speak evil or anti-wisdom. That's one of the contrasts at the very beginning of our reading. You either speak, and he says this in a different way, heavenly or else spiritual wisdom, or you boast earthly, and the language is natural. It comes naturally to us, natural, or even, and this is really interesting, demonic. So earthly, natural, demonic wisdom. So it's either heavenly or earthly. It's either spiritual or unspiritual. And it's actually demonic, James says. It's pretty strong language, right? You're either a friend of God, he'll say in chapter 4, or you're an enemy of God. This is characteristic, this kind of black and white stark language is characteristic of wisdom literature. You can be prideful or you can be humble. There is no gradation here, right? We're all kind of a mixture of a lot of these things, but in classic wisdom literature fashion, this is how James presents it to us. So if you remember from last week, we were considering a lot of different rhetorical questions, and maybe centrally the question was, are you a bad judge? And I answered that hopefully clearly, and I demonstrated that. We all are bad judges. And so our reading from James begins with yet another question. Look with me at verse 13 of chapter 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Among you. Now, this isn't just the beginning of a series of rhetorical questions. James answers it immediately in the second half of verse 13. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? by his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. In the meekness of wisdom. So this verse at the beginning of our sermon text, it begins with wisdom and it ends with wisdom. James is saying, here's our topic. We are talking very specifically, not about wisdom literature in general, but what specifically is wisdom. So he begins with an adjective. He talks about the one who is wise, the wise person. And then he ends with wisdom, or else the noun, it's personified in some ways. Wisdom is manifest in someone whose attitude, or else their tone, or their way of being in the world is what? Is humble. Is humble, or you could say gentle, or mild. This is what wisdom looks like. And he uses a phrase, this is what the good life is. This is what it means to live the good life. You can learn wisdom from books. Now, I've just sort of ripped on appeals to authority, okay? I quote people, and I'm going to quote some people in this sermon. You can learn wisdom. You can. You can learn wisdom from books. I wouldn't read and quote C.S. Lewis so much if I didn't believe that that is true, okay? So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to read books or something like that. You can even learn wisdom from YouTubers. It is possible. Trust me, it is possible. But it's only ever really partial. It's only partial to watch a YouTube video or else discern whether or not someone is meek or humble or characterized by gentleness when they speak. And this is true of YouTube and Sunday morning sermons. It applies to preachers just as much, and maybe more specifically, because this is very much in view in James chapter 3, to pastors and to preachers, those who proclaim to not only speak for science, but speak for God. Speak for God. It is possible. You might actually get some wisdom from the pulpit this morning. You might. I don't know. You be the judge of that. What I'm doing right now, it could be wisdom or it could not be. But here's the point. James is clear. James is so clear. There is a surefire, or else a better way to know wisdom. And more so than public speaking, more so than books or YouTube videos or whatever it is. And so he asks this question, who is wise and understanding? And this phrase is so important, among us. Among us. So before I answer this question in my one point this morning from James, just remember again, one of the things that I want to do as we're reflecting on James is giving us wisdom for what we are supposed to be and how we are supposed to live between Christ's first coming and his second coming. In other words, living as people who already have confidence and hope that Jesus is going to redeem us from all things, but he hasn't done that yet fully. Okay, so we're living in this already and not yet, and so a lot of this is just sort of this not yet. Last week, God wants to make us into merciful speakers, people who speak and people who act. In other words, to be humble judges. If we are going to rule and reign over the earth someday, he wants us to be the kind of judges where that's going to be a good thing and not a bad thing. So that was last week. This morning, we want to see, what does that look like? What does it look like to be that kind of person? How can you discern if someone is wise? Are they a wise judge, and are they among us? Are they among us? And so here is what I believe James's answer is, right here. Clearly, if you want to know wisdom, he says that wisdom is embodied. Wisdom is embodied. Another way of saying that is, if you want to fully know wisdom, if you want to know someone who is wisdom, not by just what they say from a pulpit, not by the speech alone, although speaking wisdom does matter, but wisdom is fully known and learned and observed and felt and experienced righteousness. It's what happens when when Jesus is preaching about righteousness in secret, and you are in those intimate secret places with other people. This is where you discern whether or not there is true righteousness, and it's embodied over time. Now, before we unpack the positive, I want to briefly look at anti-wisdom, because that's where James goes first in verse 14. Look with me at verse 14 of James chapter 3. There are many, and we can think about the language of the Apostle Paul in many other places. I'm thinking very specifically of Philippians chapter 1, but he says this over and over again. There are many who preach because of envy. This is the word that James uses in verse 14. Envy and rivalry. They're bitter, to use the language of James. They're resentful, always comparing themselves to others. This is a preacher trap. It's a pretty dangerous trap. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, these kind of people who preach because of envy or rivalry or these kinds of things, they have a kind of knowledge. They have a kind of wisdom even, but Paul says they're puffed up. They are puffed up, always quarreling about words, which causes, and here's the language of James, right here in verse 14, bitter jealousy. Bitter jealousy. This is anti-wisdom. They are marked by ambition, never content to simply have something or accomplish something. It doesn't matter if I accomplish something. I just want to accomplish more than the next guy. It doesn't matter if we have a good number of people. I just want to have more than someone else. It's always competitive. It's never satisfied. This is the mark of anti-wisdom, whether it's more likes or more followers or more wins or more points, more assists, more votes. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is the default. This is the default, James says, of the world. And when we say the world, I want you to think very personally about my world, my always restless, never content, always sort of comparing myself to others, to feel more highly about myself or else to beat myself up. This is the place that we live in a lot. This is our default. This person, one who is characterized by bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, they, James says, leave a trail of wreckage wherever they go. Disorder is the language that James uses. Everything was in order and now it's chaos. Every vile practice is in their wake. And this is especially true when we are ambitious, and this is very much the context here in James chapter 3, when we're ambitious for the gospel, ambitious for spiritual things. It's so easy to explain away everyone who has fallen away because of they're just not with me. They're not up to my ambition. And all those people are simply people who aren't really Christians, as one guy I had a conversation with in the YMCA said this week. They're not really Christians if they don't stay on the bus. They can get off the bus and we might even run them over. James says that this kind of wisdom, this anti-wisdom, comes natural to us. This is where we live, and you can apply it yourself, and I know that we are this morning. This is not only the way of our fallen and broken world, it's demonic. And so even if you feel like, oh man, I am gaining some traction and not being an anti-wise person in my life, there's another attack, there's another attack, there's another temptation, and we fall. We fall all the time. We have all of us caused this as well. We've caused this kind of disorder, and there's no question we have all experienced this kind of disorder and this kind of selfish ambition. And I'm not talking about watching persons or personalities through screens, okay? I think sometimes we think about leaders and personalities and these sorts of things. We think about foolish people who are spouting wisdom all the time on TikTok or else cable news or YouTube or whatever, and then making judgments about their character. No, I'm talking about someone who, at least at first, had the appearance of wisdom personally. They were known for, and this is a anonymous ancient commentator, they were known for overly clever preaching, but they're pretty miserable to actually be around. We don't see them online or on stage. We've lived in intimate spaces with them over time, and we've been burned. And so this is right at the center of what James is reflecting on. Do not be deceived by words. This is going back to last week. Don't be deceived by those with clever words, overly clever preaching. If you think that someone is a great speaker, if you think that they are full of wisdom or something like that, you should be paying more careful attention to them, not less. Again, I don't mean by that researching about them online. I mean, pay attention to them in the intimate spaces in your life. So back to this question. It's kind of a summary of anti-wisdom at the beginning of our sermon text. Who is wise and understanding among us? I said wisdom is embodied. It's understood and it's discerned in personal, intimate spaces. Look with me at verse 17. Let's look positively. Wisdom that comes down to us from above is first. Here's the first word. Pure. It's pure. It's without defect. And this is a moral statement. It's without any moral defect. So wisdom that is pure, it doesn't have any blemish. So it's not about being logical or else persuasive or rhetorically pure or something like that. It's about purity in conduct. So firstly, wisdom is pure. It's pure actions. It's pure actions. That's in view. Secondly, wisdom that is pure, or else a wise person is peaceable. James says it's peaceable. This is a wise person is one who's characterized, and this is what this word means, freedom from anxiety and inner turmoil. This person, a wise person, is someone who is free from anxiety and inner turmoil. And I read this definition of this word, and I immediately thought of an Andy Golohorn song. I love Andy Golohorn. He talks about coming to confession. I'm ready to get something off my chest. And he says, have you ever felt compelled to get a weight off your chest? But then at that moment, you can't follow through because you are ashamed. This is what Andy Golohorn says. And then he pauses as if to say, I've done that so many times. That's where I feel whenever I see this. Someone who's peaceable, someone who's free from anxiety and inner turmoil. And Andy Golohorn says, because their lives, this person who is peaceable, their lives are marked with freedom and with peace. And I don't have either. They're peaceable. Number 3, gentle. Gentle. A wise person is someone who is gracious and patient, not when everyone deserves graciousness and patience. They're gracious and patient when they're provoked. This is what gentleness is. 4th, they are open to reason. You could just say reasonable. They're a reasonable person. They're willing to listen. Think about this kind of person. A wise person is willing to listen. They're open to hear you. So they don't just want to hear themselves speak. They want to listen to what you have to say. And they're open to being wrong. They're actually listening. Number 5, a wise person is full of mercy and good fruits. Full of mercy and good fruits. We know people who are abundantly full of kindness. This is the idea. They're full of kindness to those who are needy around them, to those who are in need. And the natural result, and this reverses the natural or else demonic tendency of the earth, the wise person's natural result of their actions or else their fruit is goodness. It's righteousness. It's goodness in their life. Verse 18, he says it like this: their fruit is righteousness in peace. It's righteousness and peace. They reap peace because they are sowers of peace with those who are in need around them all the time. Number 6, a wise person is impartial, and this goes back to chapter 2, which we reflected on last week. They are merciful judges. It's not about not making judgments, it's about being humble. It's about being humble judges. They are clear-sighted in judgment. They have taken the log out of their own eye so that they can see clearly the speck in someone else's eye. They're impartial. They're patient, and they don't judge based upon appearance. They don't, and this is another way to say this, they're not prejudging people all over the place based upon appearance. Certainly not based upon appearance. They're not showing partiality. This is what the wise person is. And 7th, James says, and finally, a wise person is sincere. They're sincere. In other words, they're not showy. They're not making a show of their wisdom, or else a show even of their humility. Even when they throw a fancy dinner party, it's not a show. We know this kind of person. They roll the red carpet out, and it's clearly not about them. Sometimes it's hard to discern at first, but certainly over time, we know when people are all doing it for show. Like we can intuit this over and over again. When we're in people's presence, we can feel it. We can feel it when someone isn't genuine, when they're not sincere. The wise person isn't showy, they are sincere. You cannot listen to this sermon. You cannot watch YouTube. You cannot read a news article about anyone, whether, again, about a political candidate or a movie star or any kind of celebrity and whatever you're reading about, and discern if they are truly wise. There's no way in the end to finally do that. There are many people at CTK. If you spend time with them, you will come to know, truly know, that there are so many people here who are pure and peaceable and gentle and reasonable and merciful and impartial and sincere. They're sitting all around you. They're sitting all around you. The health of a pastor or a parish isn't marked by numbers or good sermons, but by peace, by true peace, by peacefulness. In other words, when you enter into a home or else an intimate space or into a face-to-face intimate relationship with someone, do you want to stay there? That's the question of peace. Is it a place you want to take your shoes off and be? Just be. Is it peaceful? Is righteousness lived, and not just talked about, but lived? Wisdom cannot be discerned. You cannot tell if I'm wise just by what I'm saying right now. There's no way to finally make that decision. You can't read about a church or see their website or watch a sermon on YouTube or even go to see it in person and then make that judgment. That's all the sort of outward, easy to sort of see. I wish it were that easy. I really wish you could do that. You could figure out, okay, here are all the wise people, and here are all the people who are just masquerading. They have the appearance of wisdom. No, wisdom is known. It is caught. It is learned. Wisdom is practiced in merciful living face-to-face over time. Wisdom is embodied. This is the test of wisdom. Who is wise and understanding among us? Who is wise and understanding among us? Like many of the questions that James asks in this letter, and I confessed last week that I don't much like reading this letter because I hear a long list of all these virtues or else these habits or practice of a wise person, I hear this and I go, who among us is actually wise? That's my answer. Who lives up to that? Who does that? I'm with Andy Gullahorn. Well, I've heard that you can tell the ones who truly open up because their lives are marked with freedom and with peace, but I don't have either one of those. I don't have freedom or peace a lot in my day. I think that actually, in many ways, and trust me, I'm not saying I'm wise, but I know if you went around this room and did a survey of everyone who I think are wise, because I've seen them live this in intimate spaces, if you ask the wisest men and women in this room, those who aren't puffed up or quarrelsome or fighting about things all the time, those who are eager to listen to you and don't talk about themselves all the time, they are almost certainly the first people to say, I'm not the wise person. I am not that person. I am totally not the wise person. Or as the Father said in our gospel reading from last week, I believe, help my unbelief. They'll say, oh Lord, don't look to me as the one who has wisdom. And this is the beginning of wisdom. This is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, this is the first step into a proper posture before God. Look with me at chapter 4 and verse 1. Here's some more questions. If I don't feel like the wise person, or else I know myself to be the anti-wise person all the time, who's comparing myself to other people, what is the way out? Verse 1 of chapter 4. James asks another question. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? So it starts here. It starts here with me. You desire, you want stuff, and you do not have, so you murder. You take it. You do it for yourself. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You don't ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions, you adulterous people. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, if you feel like the adulterous person after the survey of what is wisdom, therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the Scripture says, the Spirit that He has made to dwell in us, it tends toward jealousy. But He gives more grace. He gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I am very often not wise. I learn this a little bit more acutely every day. And this isn't just a danger of extroverts, although it's pretty clear with extroverts. I can be all talk. I can be all talk. I could start with my mouth running. But more intimately, I tend towards envy, the opposite of contentment. I can be selfish and call it godly ambition, conceited, or else always worried about what everyone else says about me, and everything is oriented towards me, and jealous. I could be performance-oriented all the time, rivalry, maybe not outwardly, but very much inwardly, towards thinking that I am wise because I watched a 15-minute YouTube video, or even worse, I think that I'm wise because of my bookshelf. But James says that I am not without hope, and neither are you. Because, he says, God gives more grace. God gives more grace. greater grace, more grace. Not only does God pour out His grace upon every single person who has been abused by anti-wise people, who have been broken and abused by, to use the language of James, demonic fools in the world and in the church. And this is very much in view here in James chapter 3. He gives more grace to you, to every single person who acknowledges their sin, their own sin and foolishness. God gives grace to the humble, the ones who make themselves low. Are you all talk? Are you really good at doing your morning devotions and then snapping at your kids all day? Do you think that God approves of you because you think that you did something good, or else you performed your role well, or you preached a good sermon, or whatever it is? Tell God what He already knows. I am a foolish wreck. I'm an anti-wise person. I am a sinner. Bow down, and here's the beautiful reality. Bow down for wisdom, wisdom who is enfleshed, and Christ will absolutely and every time declare over you grace, more grace, more grace. The Venerable Bede says it like this: they who in the midst of the wounds of their vices. So I love this. He speaks about the wounds of not all the things that people have wounded me. He's very real and clear about being bruised and broken by the world. But he says, they who in the midst of the wounds of their vices humbly put themselves in the hand of the true physician, they rightly receive the gift of the hoped for cure. Thanks be to God. God gives more grace to the humble. And on top of that, God's mercy, His divine grace, doesn't mean that you are hopeless in the pursuit of wisdom. So even when we hold all of this list of all the characteristics of what a wise person is, God says we don't have to be hopeless. We actually can be wise in this age. We actually can be the kinds of people who live peaceably with other people around us, and where other people want to come in and get closer in and live at peace with us. We can be that kind of person. Here's John Chrysostom. I'm going to make a lot of appeals to authority here. I'm almost done. He says, James does not remove the power to do good. He doesn't remove the power to do good, but he shows that it is not just a matter of one's own will. It's not just do better, Christian, Chrysostom says. To do good as we ought, he says, we need the grace of God from first to last. We need the grace of God in order to pursue wisdom, to do good. So who is wise and understanding among us? The answer is that Christ is wisdom. He is truly among us. He is real and He is present here with us. This is something we believe by faith and we can experience because of peace. Wisdom died and rose again, and He conquered the earthly and the unspiritual and the demonic, everything outside of us that wages war against us, and all of our junk, all of our stuff inside. He conquered it to save us, and to use the language of Bede, to heal us. To heal us. Wisdom was and is forevermore embodied in Jesus Christ the Son, and more than that, He gives more grace. God has given us embodied wisdom. Right here, many wise and understanding people among us, many fathers and many mothers who you can follow and trust and live with in peace. Humble and merciful judges who are ready and eager to forgive because they've been forgiven. Fruitful and meek and quiet knowers who are ready to teach, lovers of God who love deeply in secret. They are seated all around you this morning. Thanks be to God. God gives us more grace. Therefore, because God gives more grace, therefore, because God has blessed us with embodied examples of wisdom, those who bear good fruit among us, therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, that you may be healed, James says. That you may be healed right now. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. My brothers and my sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.